The camera was still running when I pulled the SD card. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The camera was fine. The strap was fine. Nothing had touched it. Whatever passed in front of that lens at 2:47 in the morning on the second Tuesday of October didn't knock it over, didn't claw it off the post, didn't do a single thing to it except walk through the frame and leave me with 11 seconds of footage. I have never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. My name is Curtis Alderman. I farm 260 acres outside Delphi, in Carroll County, Indiana. Down in the Deer Creek Valley where the ground rolls and the creek cuts slate bluffs along the low side of the property. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. I've worked this land my whole life. My grandfather broke the north field in 1931. My father put in the drainage tile on the east side in 1964. I took over the full operation in 2003 when Dad's knees gave out, and I have not missed a single planting season since. Corn on the flat ground, soybeans on the rotation, a little wheat in some years. The south end of the property drops off into timber along the creek sugar, maple, and red oak, and a good stand of hackberry in the wet ground near the water. And I've hunted that timber since I was old enough to carry a rifle. I put my first trail camera in the creek bottom 7 years ago. A Browning Strike Force I bought at the farm co-op in Delphi. By last fall, I was running 4 cameras in the timber, plus one I'd set on the post at the corner of the old bank barn, angled toward the lane that runs between the barn and the first soybean field. That corner post camera was the one that caught it. I want to back up and tell this the way it actually happened, because the footage is only the end of it. The footage is the part that convinced me I wasn't losing my mind. But the thing that started it, the thing that put me out in the creek bottom with a flashlight at midnight in the first place, happened 3 weeks before I ever pulled that card. Before I get into the details, I want to be clear about what I'm not. I am not a person who looks for this kind of thing. I don't spend time on forums or watch videos about cryptids or whatever word you want to use. I am a working farmer with an operation that generates more paperwork than I care to think about. And in a normal year, my idea of a good evening is checking the extended forecast on the laptop and going to bed at 9. Ellen will tell you I've fallen asleep in the recliner before the local news is halfway done more times than either of us can count. I mention this because I want you to understand that the frame I was carrying going into all of this was as ordinary as it gets. I wasn't primed for it. I wasn't looking for it. And the night it looked for me, I'd have given a good deal to be wrong about what I was seeing. The south end of the property is the part of the farm that was never fully broken to crops. My grandfather tried for 2 seasons and quit. The slope into the creek bottom is too steep and the ground too wet in spring for reliable corn production. And by the time drainage tile would have been a solution, the farm was committed to the flat ground and the South 60 was just left to go back to timber. That was in the 1940s. And in 80-plus years, those trees have grown into genuine old-growth character. Not ancient, but old enough that the red oak on the ridge has canopy crowns 30 feet across, and the sugar maple along the creek is 6 feet around at the base in places. It's the kind of timber that holds its own microclimate. On a hot August afternoon, you can walk into that south end from the field edge and drop 5 or 6 degrees in 50 yards. In November, it holds the cold the same way, keeps it low and still long after the wind has cleaned out the open ground. I had hunted that timber for most of my adult life. White-tailed deer mostly, some turkey in spring, and for 15 years I was serious enough about it that I kept a log dates, weather, stand locations, what I saw, and what I didn't, whether the scrapes were fresh. If you want to understand how a piece of timber behaves, you keep records for a decade and a half. You get to where you know it the way a man knows his fields, which means you notice when things are wrong. And that fall, things had gone wrong in the south timber 2 full weeks before I set the barn camera, and 3 weeks before I pulled that card. The deer sign went quiet. That's the first thing I noticed. By the first week of October, the rut sign should have been picking up fresh scrapes on the oak flats above the creek bluff. Rubs on the bigger saplings where the bucks were working velvet. I checked those things automatically, without deciding to, like checking the oil on a piece of equipment. In the 3rd week of September, I'd been down there, and the sign had been good. 6 scrapes on the flat between the 2 largest red oaks, a double rub on a 4-inch wild cherry. By the time I went back in the first week of October, every one of those scrapes had gone cold. Nothing fresh. The rubs, untouched. And in 12 days of checking camera 1, which I had on a trail between the creek bluff and the timber edge, not a single deer image. Not a doe, not a buttonbuck, nothing. I've run cameras in that timber for 7 years, and I have never had 12 days of total inactivity in October, which is the most active month of the year for deer movement in Indiana. I told Ellen at dinner one night that the deer had moved off the south end, and she asked me why I thought that was. I told her I didn't know, that sometimes they shift around for reasons that aren't obvious, that the acorn crop on the ridge had been lighter than usual that year, and maybe they'd moved to follow it. I believed most of that when I said it. It was the reasonable explanation, and the reasonable explanation is almost always right. It started with the cattle. I run a small beef herd alongside the row crops, 12 Angus cows and a bull. Nothing fancy, mostly to make use of the pasture ground on the west side, where the soil runs too thin and sandy for reliable row crop production. My neighbor to the south, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who has farmed the adjoining ground for 30 years and whose opinion I trust more than most, had commented to me in late September that my cattle were behaving strangely. He'd seen them from his truck on County Road 900 North, pressed up against the east fence of the pasture in the middle of the day, all facing the same direction, all looking toward the timber on the creek side. Not grazing, just standing and looking. Gerald said he'd slowed down and watched them for a minute or two and then driven on because he had places to be, but it stuck with him enough that he mentioned it to me the next time we crossed paths at the elevator in Delphi. I told him cattle do odd things, which is true, and I didn't think much of it until I saw it myself.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time, so if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The second week of October, I was running beans on the east field, watching the monitor on the combine, and I happened to look west toward the pasture around 3 in the afternoon. The whole herd was at the east fence. Gerald had described it exactly right. Every single animal with its body pressed against the wire, all facing south, all looking toward the tree line along the creek. The bull was in the front. He's a 3-year-old Angus I bought as a yearling, and he has never given me trouble, calm enough that I can walk up on him in the pasture without a second thought. He was standing with his head down and his ears laid back, and even from 2 fields away I could see that his neck was bowed up the way a bull's neck gets when something's wrong. The cows behind him were bunched close, which is what cattle do when they're frightened. They bunch, and they face the threat together. The pasture fence ends at the south, and the timber begins maybe 40 yards beyond it. And whatever they were looking at was in that timber, and I couldn't see a thing from where I sat in the cab. I finished the pass I was on, and I did go look. I walked out to the fence and stood there, and the cattle moved off a little when I got close, which is unusual. They usually come toward me. The bull moved off with the cows instead of standing his ground. I looked into the timber, and there was nothing to see. Late afternoon light through the maple and oak canopy. The creek sound. A blue jay working somewhere in the hackberry. Nothing I could put a name to, but the smell was there. I noticed it after maybe a minute of standing at that fence. It came on a shift of wind off the timber, a heavy, wet, animal smell. But wrong in a way I couldn't quite put words to. I grew up around hogs and cattle and working dogs, and I know what those animals smell like. Know the difference between a wet dog and a dry one. Know what a hog pen smells like on a hot August morning versus a cold November one. This was none of those things. It was like a large dog that had been rolling in something dead. But there was a musk underneath it that I'd never encountered before. Heavy and close, like the inside of a den if a den had been used hard for a long time by something with a body temperature higher than a man's. That's the only way I know how to say it. I stood at that fence for another 2 minutes, and then I went back to the combine, and I told myself it was probably a coyote den somewhere in the creek bottom. I know what a coyote den smells like, too. I've come across 2 of them in 30 years of moving through that timber, both in the old groundhog holes up on the dry ridge above the bluff. A coyote den has a musky, sharp smell, fox-like. The cattle in my pasture don't particularly care about coyotes. They're aware of them. Yes, the cows will bunch up a little if a coyote moves across the field edge, but they don't press the fence. They don't stand with their necks bowed and their ears laid back. My bull has run coyotes off before. When they've come close to a calving cow, he faces them and moves toward them, and they give ground. He does not stand with his head down and his neck rolled up like whatever is outside is bigger than he is. That is what kept working at me on the drive back up to the machine shed. I had 12 years of watching that bull, and I knew the difference between how he carries himself when a coyote is nearby and how he looked at that south fence. He looked at that fence like an animal that had done the calculation and come up short. I had 4 cameras in the timber. I checked them that weekend. 3 of them had mostly deer, a nice 8-pointer on the scrape line east of the creek. Some does. A fat raccoon that kept showing up at camera 2 at the same time every night like he had a schedule to keep. The 4th camera, the one I'd set on an old red oak at the south end of the property where the timber thickened before the creek bend, had nothing on it for the first 11 days of October, and then a single image at 3:14 in the morning on the 12th. The image was dark, the way all nighttime trail camera images are. The infrared wash turning everything into shades of white and gray and black. At the edge of the frame, the right edge, where the camera's field of view gave out, there was a shape. I almost deleted it as a false trigger, which cameras on that model will sometimes do when a large branch swings in the wind and the temperature differential between the branch and the background is big enough to fool the sensor. I almost deleted it. I didn't, because the shape was wrong for a branch. It was upright. Whatever was at the right edge of that frame was standing on 2 legs. The camera had caught maybe the left third of it before the frame ended, a long arm hanging at the side, a portion of a torso that was wide across the chest and tapered differently than a man's, and the beginning of a neck that was thick and set forward. The head itself was out of frame. The arm was the thing I kept coming back to. It hung almost to what would have been the knee, and the hand at the end of it, I'll call it a hand because I don't know what else to call it, was large enough that even at the edge of the frame and in infrared gray, the fingers were visible and they were long. I showed that image to exactly one person, my wife, Ellen. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then she asked me what I thought it was, and I told her I didn't know. She asked me if I was going to call anyone, and I told her I didn't know that either. She didn't push it. Ellen grew up on a farm in White County, and she is not a woman who frightens easily. But she told me she didn't want me going into that south end of the timber alone, and I told her I wasn't planning to. I thought about what she'd said for a few days, and then I went back in anyway, which she knew I would and didn't fight me on. I went in the middle of a clear afternoon, which felt safer than I'd like to admit, and I went to the red oak where camera 4 had been, and I stood there, and I looked at the ground. There were tracks in the soft soil between the root flares of the oak. I want to be clear that I am not a tracker. I hunt white-tailed deer, and I've learned enough over the years to read deer sign and identify the basics: whitetail versus turkey, raccoon versus opossum, that kind of thing. What was in the soil between those roots was beyond my ability to confidently identify. But I can tell you what I saw. There were depressions that had the character of footprints, a general oval shape with a broader area at the front, and they were large. Each one was longer than my own boot by a significant margin, which would put them at close to 14 inches. That's too large for any canine I know of in Indiana. The coyote is the largest wild canid we have here, and a coyote track runs about 2 to 2.5 inches long. A domestic dog large enough to leave a 14-inch track would be an animal of unusual size, well outside anything I'd heard of in the county, and a dog that size doesn't travel the Deer Creek bottom without somebody knowing about it. The stride between the depressions was long. That's the part that troubled me as much as the size. I paced it out, front to front. The distance between the prints was over 5 feet, which is a very long step for an animal moving at a walking pace, and the arrangement of the prints was not the 4-beat pattern of a walking quadruped. It was a 2-beat pattern. Left, right, left, right. Evenly spaced and in a straight line, the way a person walks. I didn't take pictures. I didn't have my phone. I've kicked myself for that more times than I can count. But I went into that timber in the middle of the afternoon, specifically to tell myself there was nothing down there, and I didn't prepare for the possibility that I would find something to document. I moved the camera from the red oak and set it 40 yards north, on a sugar maple that had a clear sight line south toward the creek bend and north toward the pasture fence. I angled it lower than I normally would. I usually set cameras at chest height for deer, which puts the lens at about 4.5 feet. I set this one at 6 feet. I told myself it was because I wanted a wider field of view. That wasn't the whole reason. Then I waited. The cattle kept doing it. Every clear day that second half of October. Late afternoon. The whole herd at the east fence, facing the timber. It didn't matter what time I looked if the sky was clear and the wind was coming out of the south. They were at that fence. On cloudy days, or when the wind came from the north, they grazed normally. I started writing down which days and what the wind was doing. I didn't have a theory exactly, but keeping records felt better than not keeping them. Gerald Whitmore came by one afternoon to return a trailer I'd lent him, and he saw the cattle at the fence again. He stood by his truck and watched them for a minute, and then he looked at me and said, kind of quiet, that he'd heard something in his north timber 2 nights before. I asked him what kind of something. He said a howl. He said it wasn't a coyote. He said he'd heard coyotes his whole life, and this wasn't one. That it started out low and climbed into something that had a voice in it the way a coyote's doesn't, more like a person yelling through a dog's throat. He said it had come from the direction of the creek and that it had gone on for maybe 4 or 5 seconds and then stopped, and that his dog, an old beagle named Pepper that lived on his porch, had gone under the porch and not come back out until morning. I hadn't heard anything like that. But Gerald's north timber and my south timber share a fence line, and whatever was down in that creek bottom had a range that covered both properties. I want to be clear about the geography because it matters. The Deer Creek in Carroll County is a real waterway. It runs through the valley and eventually into the Wabash River north of Delphi. The slate bluffs along the lower sections of the creek are a known feature of this part of the county. Shale and limestone layered up where the creek has cut into the valley floor over a long time. The timber along the creek on my south end is maybe 60 acres of mature hardwood, that red oak and sugar maple I mentioned, some hackberry and elm in the wet ground near the water, and a good stand of wild black cherry on the ridge above the slate bluff. It's thick in there, the kind of timber that holds deer and turkeys all season because it's dense enough that you're not pressuring them from the outside. I've hunted it for 20 years, and there are parts of it I've never pushed into. The low ground, just above the creek that gets flooded in wet springs and grows up with a tangle of brush and deadfall that makes for hard going even without leaves on. That low ground is where the smell was coming from. The night I actually heard it, it was the 21st of October, a Monday, just past midnight. I know the date because I'd been up late working on the combine header. I'd broken a knife section on the last bean field of the season, and I was in the shop replacing it. The shop is in the same building as the old bank barn, a concrete block addition my father put on the east end in 1978. The barn itself is a Schweitzer-style bank barn, built in the 1880s, the kind where the upper level opens onto a ramp on the uphill side, and the lower level is dug into the bank below. It's been in continuous use since it was built, and it's big 60 feet across the main bay and another 30 in the added-on section. We stable the cattle in the lower level in winter. I was in the shop with the door rolled partway up, enough to let the cold air in, and I was about done with the knife section when the cattle started moving. I could hear them through the wall because the shop shares a wall with the lower barn. Cattle don't move much at night when they're penned, and in October they were still out on pasture, not stabled yet, so the sound I was hearing was the cattle coming up from the pasture and pushing against the lower barn door, which is a heavy wooden sliding door on the south side of the building. I could hear them against that door, that shuffling, restless pressing sound that cattle make when they're agitated, and underneath it, the bull making a sound I'd never heard him make, not a bellow. Something lower and more continuous, a kind of low, continuous rumble in his chest that vibrated through the wall. I set down the wrench and went to the door and looked out. The yard between the shop and the south soybean field was empty. The field light on the corner of the barn lit up the gravel yard and the first 30 yards of lane running south, and beyond the lane the field went black. It was a clear night, cold. Stars out. No wind. The cattle were against the barn behind me, pressed up and pushing, and the bull was still making that sound. Then I heard the other sound. It came from the south, from out beyond the field, from the direction of the timber. And it wasn't a howl the way Gerald had described one. It was more like a series of sounds strung together, a low grunt followed by a sharp, short bark that wasn't quite a bark, wasn't quite a cough, and then a pause, and then two more of the same, like a signal, maybe, or a communication. The kind of structured repeat that you'd recognize as intentional if you heard a person make it. I stood in the door of the shop and I did not move, and I listened, and the sound did not repeat. The cattle behind me pressed harder against the barn door. The bull's rumble dropped in pitch and then stopped entirely, which somehow was worse than when it was going. I went back inside and I did not go out again that night. I set the fifth camera, the one on the barn corner post, the next morning. I chose that corner because it had a sight line down the lane to the south, the direction everything seemed to be coming from. The lane runs between the barn on the west and the first soybean field on the east, about 15 feet wide, gravel for the first 100 feet, and then dirt, and it ends at the field road that runs along the south edge of the farm before the timber begins. I set the camera at 6 feet on the post, angled to cover the lane and the edge of the field, and I set it on a 30-second burst mode, 3 images per trigger, because I didn't want to miss a sequence the way I'd missed the sequence at the red oak wherever that shape had come from, and wherever it had gone. The camera at the red oak had only caught the tail end of it passing through. I checked all 5 cameras every 3 days through the rest of October. The 4 timber cameras stayed quiet. Normal deer movement, the raccoon on his schedule, a coyote once at camera 3, small and low slung in the infrared. Nothing like what I'd seen at the edge of the frame at camera 4. The barn camera had barn traffic, the tomcat that lives in the hayloft, me coming and going, Gerald's pickup pulling into the yard one afternoon when he stopped to talk, his old dog Pepper riding in the back and not liking whatever she smelled when they got out of the truck, which I noticed but didn't say anything about. The sound came back twice more in the last week of October. Once in the middle of the night on the 26th, the grunt and bark sequence again, from the timber, but closer than before. Once on the 29th, just at dusk, a single long sound from somewhere south of the field road that stopped short of what I'd call a howl but started out like one. Ellen heard that one. She was at the kitchen sink and she came to the back door and looked at me in a way that didn't need words, and I looked back at her, and neither of us said anything. The second Tuesday of November, I had the date wrong when I started telling this. It was November, not October. I pulled all 5 cards on a clear afternoon and went through them on the laptop in the kitchen. The timber cameras were quiet. Camera 3 had a doe and 2 fawns at 1:30 in the morning. Camera 4, the one on the sugar maple I'd moved, had another image, with the same quality as the red oak image, a shape at the right side of the frame, gone before the next image in the burst. I zoomed in on it, and it was less distinct than the first one, more shadow than shape. But it was there, and it was the right height and the right posture. The barn camera card I looked at last. The first image in the sequence, time-stamped 2:46 and 53 seconds, was empty. The lane, the edge of the field, the gravel, the field light throwing a yellow pool at the bottom of the frame. Nothing in it. The camera had triggered on a heat source outside the frame or on a temperature shift. The second image, time-stamped 2:47 and 0:1 second 8 seconds later, showed the lane with something in it. I sat there looking at that image for a long time before I went to the video clip. The Browning strike force on that camera was set to capture both still images and a 10-second video when it triggered. I knew that. I'd set it up that way specifically. But I'd been looking at the stills first, and I'd forgotten about the video until I saw the still, and my hand went a little unsteady on the mouse, and I sat back and told myself to slow down. The still image showed a figure in the lane. It was bipedal, walking upright on two legs, and it was wide in the shoulders and tapered at the waist in a way that was roughly human in its outline, except that it was too tall and the head was wrong. The barn camera sat at 6 feet on that post, and the figure's head was at or above the level of the camera. Whatever was walking down my lane at 2:47 in the morning was at least 7 feet tall by that measurement, maybe more. The head in the image was long and forward set, not the round profile of a human head, and the ears. This is the part I had to zoom in on to be sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. The ears were pointed and set high. The arms were long. The figure was facing south, moving away from the camera, and in its arms, held against its chest the way a person carries something precious or fragile, was a smaller shape. I sat with that still image for 3 or 4 minutes, and then I opened the video file. Before I describe the video, I want to describe what I know about the barn camera's behavior, because it matters to understanding what was captured. The Browning Strikeforce model I had on that corner post uses a passive infrared sensor, PIR, the same technology in motion-activated lights and security cameras that works by detecting changes in the heat signature within its detection zone. The sensor doesn't see motion directly, it detects the infrared radiation difference between a moving object and the background behind it. On a cold November night, a large, warm-bodied animal registers very distinctly against the cool background, which is why cold weather detections are often cleaner than warm weather ones. The camera had been set at maximum sensitivity. A large animal in a cold detection environment will trigger that camera at ranges up to 100 feet or more, which means whatever walked into my lane that night could have been triggering the camera well before it entered the frame of the actual image. The first still, at 2:46 and 53 seconds, was empty, just the lane and the field light and the edge of the soybean field. What that almost certainly means is that the camera's PIR sensor picked up the heat signature of something approaching from behind or alongside the barn before the subject entered the camera's visual field. The sensor woke the camera up. The camera took its first image in the burst, and the subject had not yet moved into frame. 8 seconds later, in the second still, it had. The video clip was 11 seconds. I have watched it enough times now that I know every frame of it, and I want to describe it as accurately as I can because the description matters more than any embellishment I could add. The figure enters the frame from the top, from the barn side, which means it had come from behind or alongside the barn, from the direction of the lower stable level, and it is moving south down the lane. It moves smoothly, not fast, unhurried, the way something moves when it knows exactly where it's going. The gait is upright, and the weight shifts from foot to foot in a way that a person's gait shifts, except that the stride is long, longer than a tall man's stride by a significant margin, and the upper body barely moves with the steps. It doesn't swing its shoulders the way a person does when walking. The torso stays level, and the legs work underneath it. The thing it is carrying in its arms is small, smaller than the figure itself by a factor that is hard to judge without a reference point. But I'd estimate it at maybe a third the size of the adult, which, if the adult is 7 feet tall, makes the carried shape roughly 2.5 feet. Maybe a little more. It is wrapped against the adult's chest with both arms, and the adult's hands large, clearly visible in the infrared. The fingers, as long as I'd registered in the still image, are positioned to support it from underneath. One hand under what might be the shoulders and one under what might be the hindquarters or lower back. It is oriented horizontally, the way you'd carry an injured animal or a sleeping child. Its head, if it has one distinct from its body in a way the camera can resolve, is at the adult's left side, tucked against the adult's chest. The adult reaches the edge of the field, light at about the 7-second mark of the 11-second clip. At the 8-second mark, it slows. Not stops, slows, just for a moment, and the head turns. It turns back toward the barn, toward the camera. And I want to say it looked at the camera, but I don't know if it saw the camera or if it turned because it heard something I didn't, or because it registered the infrared flash, or for some other reason I don't have access to. The face does not resolve in the video the way the body does. The infrared is good at catching body heat and motion, but the face is in partial shadow, and the camera is 6 feet off the ground and angled down. And what I can see is the outline of the head, the long muzzle, the high-set ears, the neck that is thicker and shorter than a person's, and 2 points of reflected light where the eyes catch the camera's infrared illuminator and throw it straight back. Then the head turns forward again, and the figure moves out of the bottom of the frame into the dark beyond the field light. And the clip ends. 11 seconds. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. I did not call Ellen in from the other room. I watched the clip again, and then I closed the laptop and went and stood at the back window and looked out at the barn and the lane, which were dark and still and completely ordinary in the way that things look after you've seen something on a screen that you can't put back. Then I did what probably looked crazy and probably was. I put my boots on, and I went out to the barn. Ellen came to the back door when she heard me going. She asked me what I was doing, and I told her I was going to check the lower stable. She looked at me for a second, and she said she was coming with me. I told her to stay in the house, and she told me very directly that she was coming with me, and that was the end of that conversation. We went out together. I had the flashlight and I had the 30-30 from behind the door, which Ellen saw and did not comment on. The yard was cold, maybe 38 degrees, and still, and the barn was a big dark shape against the stars, and the lane ran south into the dark, and the timber was a black line beyond the field. I want to be precise about the time and conditions because they matter for understanding what I found inside. It was approximately 3 in the morning. The temperature had been dropping since sunset and was below 40 degrees. There was no wind, which meant that whatever I was smelling when I walked into that barn came to me clearly and without dilution from moving air. I mention the cold specifically because of what the vet would tell me later about the depression that a large, warm-bodied animal lying on loose hay in a cold structure for several hours would compress that hay significantly and would leave a residual warmth that would hold for some time after the animal left. When I got to the southeast corner that night and put my hand into the depression before I thought better of it, the hay under my palm was still noticeably warmer than the hay 2 feet away. That warmth told me that whatever had been in that corner had not been gone long. The lower barn door, the big wooden sliding door on the south side, the one the cattle had been pushing against in October, was open. Not standing open, pushed open. The door slides on a top rail, and it takes a real effort to move, because the rail is old, and the door is heavy, and it had been latched from the outside with a hook and eye that my father put on in the 1980s, and that I have never had reason to replace because it works fine. The hook was not broken. The eye was not pulled from the wood. The hook itself was hanging straight down, unlatched, the way it would be if someone had lifted it carefully from the outside and set it aside. The door was pushed 3 feet open. I stood outside that open door with the flashlight and the rifle, and I listened. And Ellen stood behind my right shoulder, and she was very quiet, and from inside the barn I could hear the cattle. They were in there. They'd come in on their own through the open door. At some point in the night, cattle will do that if a door is open, especially in cold weather. They know the barn. They were not agitated. They were doing what cattle do in a barn at night, which is stand around and breathe and shift their weight. The bull was quiet. I went in. The lower level of that bank barn is a big space, 60 feet long and about 30 wide, with the concrete floor and the old stanchions my grandfather put in that we don't use anymore, and the newer pipe rail pens on the east side where we winter the cattle. The ceiling is low at the front and higher toward the back where the bank rises. It smells of cattle and old wood and the mineral scent of concrete, and that night there was a fourth smell laid over all of it. The same smell from the pasture fence, the same heavy, wet, animal musk I'd caught that first afternoon. It was concentrated in the southeast corner of the lower level, near the old stanchions, and it was strong enough that Ellen caught it immediately and put her hand over her nose without my saying anything. I swept the flashlight through the corner. In the southeast corner, in the space between the last stanchion and the wall, on a bed of loose hay that had sifted down from the loft through the cracks in the floor overhead, there was a depression, an impression in the hay. the way an animal makes when it lies down in a nest of material and compresses it with its weight. The depression was large, maybe 4 feet long and 2 feet across, oval, with the hay pushed out around the edges the way it gets pushed when something has been pressing down on it. At the narrow end of the oval, smaller, another impression, rounder, maybe 18 inches across, like a head had rested there. There was a dark smear on the lowest board of the stanchion beside the depression. I put the flashlight on it, and it was wet, and it was red. Blood. Not a lot of it. A smear maybe 6 inches long on the wood, and below it on the concrete floor, 3 drops, dark and drying at the edges. Whatever had been in that corner had been bleeding. Whatever had been in that corner had been set down there, and something large had curled around it. And at some point in the night, the large thing had lifted it again and carried it south down the lane and into the timber. Ellen and I stood in that corner for a moment. Then I collected myself enough to take out my phone and photograph the depression and the blood. I photographed the door and the unlatched hook. I photographed the lane from the doorway. Then we went back inside the house and I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and I opened the laptop and we watched the 11-second clip together. Ellen watched it twice. She didn't say anything about the figure. She asked me about the small shape in its arms, and I told her what I thought I was seeing. She was quiet for a while and then she said, very carefully, that what it looked like to her, what it looked like when she set aside everything it couldn't be, and just described what she saw was a parent carrying a hurt child. I didn't argue with her. I didn't know how to argue with that. I want to stop here and address the obvious questions, because I've had time to think through the things I should have thought of immediately and didn't, because I was sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning looking at 11 seconds of footage from my own barn camera. The first question is whether the figure could be a person. I've thought about this. A man on stilts doesn't walk with that gait. A man on stilts doesn't carry anything in both arms with that ease of movement. The stride length and the upper body stability are not consistent with any kind of mechanical extension I know of. The head shape is not a mask I'm aware of, and the ears are not prop ears on a hat, because prop ears on a hat do not interact with the infrared the way those ears do in the video. They're not a flat silhouette. They're 3-dimensional and they have the thermal signature of living tissue. I'm not a video analyst. I'm a corn and soybean farmer with a 30-year-old combine and a 4-year-old pickup and a Browning trail camera. I know what I saw. The second question is what a veterinarian would make of the blood in the depression. I asked one. Not right away. It took me the better part of 3 weeks to talk myself into it. The Carroll County area doesn't have a large animal vet of its own, and most of the farmers out this way use a practice out of Delphi that serves the surrounding counties. The vet, I know there is a man named Dr. Phil Hartwick, who has been working large animals in this part of Indiana for a long time, and who I trust because he has kept my cattle in good health for 14 years without ever charging me for something I didn't need. I called Phil and I told him I had a situation in my barn and asked him to come take a look when he had a chance. He came out on a Thursday afternoon. I showed him the corner. The depression was still there. I hadn't disturbed it. The blood on the stanchion board had dried dark. Phil crouched down and looked at the depression, and then he looked at the blood, and he took a sample with a cotton swab he had in his kit. He asked me what I thought had made the depression. I told him I didn't know, and showed him the photographs on my phone. He looked at the photographs, the depression, the blood smear, the unlocked door, without saying anything. I did not show him the video. I wasn't ready to show anyone the video. Phil told me the blood sample was too small and too degraded for him to type in field. But that based on color and consistency, it looked like blood from a mammal, which is not a very narrow range of results. He told me the depression looked like a nesting impression from a large animal, that the oval shape and the pushed-out edges were consistent with something that had lain down on its side and stayed for a while, and that the rounder impression at the narrow end was consistent with a head or a muzzle resting there. He said the size of the depression was larger than any of my cattle would make if they lay down on loose hay, that my bull, at about 1,800 pounds, would make a broader and flatter impression than what he was looking at. He said the dimensions were more consistent with something longer and narrower than a bovine. and that the dimensions of the head impression were not consistent with any domestic animal he could think of that would be on my property. He said, after a pause, that he had heard of this before. Not from a textbook, from farmers in the area. He said he'd been practicing out of Delphi for nearly 20 years, and that 3 or 4 times over that period, farmers in the creek blood in outbuildings with no source, impressions in bedding material, and that he had never been able to offer a satisfying explanation. He said he'd stopped trying to fit those situations into the categories he knew. He said, quiet and matter of fact, that the Creek country in this part of Indiana had a history that went back a long way, and that the Potawatomi people who had lived along the Wabash and its tributaries before removal in the 1830s had words for things that lived in these creek bottoms, and that those words did not translate well and were not meant to be spoken casually. He said a man he'd once met at a veterinary conference in Indianapolis, a retired wildlife biologist from Purdue who'd spent his career studying large mammal behavior in the eastern woodlands, had mentioned, almost as an aside, that there were consistent behavioral reports from farmers along creek drainages throughout the Midwest that didn't fit any known species, and that the wildlife biology community had, for professional reasons, never formally investigated. Phil said he didn't know what to do with that information, and neither had the biologist, as far as he could tell. Then he finished packing his kit and he told me to let him know if the cattle showed any signs of stress in the next few weeks, and he got in his truck and he left. And I stood in the barnyard for a while after his truck turned out onto the county road. There's something that happens when a knowledgeable person confirms that what you've experienced is real enough to have a history. It doesn't make it smaller, it makes it larger, because you understand that you've stepped into a history that other people have stepped into before you, and that has been going on, quietly, in the margins of ordinary life in this part of Indiana for longer than anyone currently living can account for. Phil Hartwick is not a credulous man. He has spent his career working with animals and farmers in an area of the country where practical problem-solving is the default mode, where if a problem doesn't have an obvious fix, you go find someone who can provide one. He is not the type to allow for the unexplained if a better explanation is available. And he had arrived at a place. Over nearly 20 years of veterinary practice in the Creek country of north-central Indiana, where some things did not have a better explanation, and he had learned to say so plainly, and then go back to his work. I asked Phil one more question before he drove away. I asked him whether he thought there was any danger to my family or my livestock. He thought about it for a moment, and then he said he'd never had a call in this county where a farmer had reported harm to livestock or people from whatever this was, that the incidents he'd heard of over the years were property disturbances and behavioral changes in animals, but nothing that constituted an attack. He said that wasn't a guarantee of anything, but he said it in a tone that meant he believed it. And Phil Hartwick's tone about a thing means something to me. I've done some reading since then. I want to be careful about this because there's a lot of material out there that I have no way to evaluate, and some of it is obvious nonsense. But there are parts of the record that I found useful in the specific way that something is useful when it helps you feel like you're not entirely alone in what you've experienced. There are accounts going back through the rural literature of the Great Lakes and the upper Midwest farmers, hunters, timber workers, people who spent their lives in the creek bottoms and the river drainages of encounters with something large and bipedal and canine in character that did not behave the way a known predator behaves. What I mean by that is that the consistent thread in those accounts is not violence and not predation. It's presence. These things were seen, and they chose to be seen. Or sometimes they were seen without choosing it. And in either case, the person who saw them was changed by it, but not hurt by it. There are outlying accounts where something went wrong and someone was hurt, but those are a small fraction. And even in those accounts, the pattern that emerges is that the thing became dangerous only when it was cornered or when something it was connected to a territory, a young one, was threatened. I want to say something about the Potawatomi connection Phil mentioned, because I looked into it as much as I was able to. The Potawatomi people were the primary inhabitants of north-central Indiana and the surrounding region until forced removal in the late 1830s. The event often called the Potawatomi Trail of Death, which began in Fulton County, just a few counties east of Carroll, In September of 1838, before removal, the Potawatomi and their predecessors had lived along the Wabash and its tributaries for generations, and their oral traditions regarding the natural world of this region are detailed and specific in a way that reflects long residence in a place. Phil had said that their words for what inhabited the creek bottoms did not translate well, and that's consistent with what I found when I tried to look into it further. The existing ethnographic record from the early contact period and the removal era documents numerous animals and spirits specific to particular waterways and timber types, and some of the descriptions that come closest to what I can find are associated with what the sources call large, bipedal forms that moved between the upland and the creek bottoms, and that were understood as neither spirit nor ordinary animal, but something that occupied its own category. I found one reference in a collection of Potawatomi oral history transcribed in the 1920s by a researcher from the Field Museum in Chicago. The collection is held at the Newberry Library and is not digitized, but I found a reference to it in a footnote of a larger academic work on Great Lakes indigenous oral tradition that described something living in the creek drainages of the Indiana interior that the informant called, in rough translation, the thing that carries its young in open country, meaning it was known to move its offspring and was considered capable of crossing farmland and open ground in ways that other large timber animals were not. I don't know what to do with that exactly, but I know what I saw on my barn camera. And what I saw was something carrying its young across open ground in the dark, and I think there is a long history in this valley of people having that experience and not being able to name it and going about their lives, carrying it in the same locked place I carry mine. That last part is the part I keep coming back to, because what I saw on that 11-second video clip was not a predator looking for prey. What I saw was a parent moving a hurt child under cover of darkness to a place it considered safe. My barn, my bank barn, which has been here since the 1880s and which has walls 3 feet thick at the base and which stays warmer than the outside air by 10 degrees, even without the cattle in it, because of the bank and the old construction and the hay in the loft above. Something injured needed warmth and shelter, and the adult that was caring for it chose my barn. I don't know what happened to the young one. I hope it was okay. I mean that with complete sincerity. And I understand how strange that sounds, but what I saw in that video was an animal taking care of what it loved, and the only part of the whole experience that has settled in me in a way that doesn't keep me awake is the part where I tell myself it found what it needed, and they made it out of my timber and into country where they were safe. What I can tell you about the weeks after is that the cattle normalized within about 10 days. They stopped pressing the fence. The bull went back to his usual temperament, calm enough to walk up on. I haven't heard the sound from the timber again, not that grunt and bark sequence or anything like it. Gerald Whitmore hasn't mentioned anything from his north timber, and I haven't brought it up. The smell was gone from the barn by the end of that first week, faded out so gradually that I'm not sure of the exact day it went away. The depression in the hay corner, I left for a while. I don't know why. I told myself it was because disturbing it felt wrong, which is about as rational as anything else I've said about this. I cleaned the corner out in December when I started stabling the cattle for winter, and I put fresh bedding in. And the barn is the same barn it has always been. I still run all 5 cameras. I check them every 3 days. The 4 timber cameras show deer and raccoon and the occasional fox, and camera 4, the one on the sugar maple, has never triggered at the edge of the frame again with anything that looks like what I saw. The barn camera shows the tomcat and the cattle and Gerald's pickup when he comes by, and my own comings and goings at all hours, which are the comings and goings of a farmer in any season. I have the 11-second video clip on a thumb drive that I keep in the locked box in the shop where I keep the farm papers and the equipment warranties. I have looked at it probably 100 times in the month since October, and every time I look at it I see the same things. The gait, the height, the carried shape, the moment when the head turns, the eyes catching the infrared, the unhurried southward movement into the dark. There's a thing that happened in December that I didn't mention earlier and that I want to include here because I think it belongs in an honest account of all of this. About 6 weeks after the night of the video, I was in the south timber checking the cameras, and I found a mark on the old red oak, the big one on the flat where I'd first set camera 4, the same tree I'd moved the camera away from after I found the tracks at its base. At about chest height on the south side of the trunk, there was a mark. A single long groove in the bark, carved down through the outer bark into the cambium layer. Maybe 14 inches long and about a quarter-inch wide, with smooth edges the way a cut made by a single pass of a sharp implement looks. It wasn't from a deer. A buck rub runs with the grain of the bark and has a torn, fibrous quality where the tines catch and pull. This was made against the grain, in one direction, and it was deep enough that the wood underneath had gone a little dark from exposure. I don't know what made that mark. I've thought about it enough to be tired of thinking about it. And I've arrived at nothing useful. A knife would make a mark like that, or a single claw drawn firmly downward. The depth was consistent throughout the 14 inches, which suggests it was made in one motion at constant pressure. I showed it to Gerald Whitmore when he came by in late December, without telling him where I'd found it or why I was interested in his opinion. He looked at it for a long time and he said he'd seen similar marks on trees in his north timber twice in the past 10 years, on ash trees near the creek, and that he'd always assumed they were from a bear. Carroll County doesn't have a significant black bear population. Bears do occasionally show up in the northern counties from Michigan dispersal, but they're not common in the Deer Creek Valley, and I didn't argue the point with Gerald. He wasn't wrong that a bear could make a mark like that. A bear could also carry a deer into a tree fork, and I have sometimes thought about that. I want to say something about the nature of what I've been carrying since that night, because I think it matters, and because I've heard from other people in this kind of situation. People who have had experiences they can't explain and have sat with them in private for a long time because they didn't know who to tell, and I want to be honest about what it does to you. It doesn't make you afraid in the way that fear usually works. Fear usually has an object. You're afraid of the dog running at you, afraid of the ice on the road, afraid of the diagnosis. This is different. What I have been living with since that second Tuesday of November is more like a rearrangement of how I understand the world I work in. I have farmed this land my whole life, and I thought I knew it the way a man knows a place he's walked every day for 50 years. I knew where the deer crossed. I knew where the creek ran low in August and high in March. I knew the south timber like I know the layout of my own kitchen, not because I thought about it, but because it was just the shape of the world. I don't know it the same way now. I know it like you know a room after you find out someone else has a key. The room is the same room. The furniture is in the same place. But you stand in it differently. The Deer Creek timber on the south end of my property looks the same as it always did. The slate bluffs are where they've always been. The red oak and the sugar maple and the hackberry in the wet ground are doing what they do every year. The creek is running clear this spring, as it always runs clear in April before the field runoff starts. I can stand at the south fence line and look into those 60 acres and see nothing out of the ordinary. I stand there differently than I used to. I stand there knowing that the 60 acres I'm looking at has a depth I didn't account for before. A layer underneath the deer movement, and the turkey roosting, and the raccoon on his midnight schedule. Something that was there long before my grandfather broke that north field in 1931. Long before the first settlers put up any structure in this valley. Long before the county roads were laid out on the grid. Something that has its own territory and its own young and its own need for shelter on a cold November night, and that chose my barn because it was a good enough judge of the land to know that what it needed was inside that building, and that the man who ran the place was not a threat to it. I don't know if that's comfort or not. Some days, it is. Some days I pull that thumb drive out of the locked box in the shop and I watch 11 seconds of footage, and I don't know what to call what I'm feeling. I still check all 5 cameras every 3 days. I don't know what I expect to find, but I check them. Ellen asked me once, a few months after, whether I wished I hadn't set up that barn camera. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told her no. I told her that whatever that thing was, it came to my barn with something hurt and in need of care, and it left without doing any harm. And the least I could do was bear witness to it accurately. The least I could do was look at what was in front of me and not talk myself out of it. She said that was a very farmer way to think about it. I told her it was probably the only way I knew how to think about anything. The south timber is leafed out now. Full canopy since mid-May. Dense in a wet spring. The maple and oak coming in thick, and the creak sound carrying up through the trees to the fence line when the wind is right. The cattle graze all the way to the south fence in the long evenings without pressing up against it or looking south. Whatever was down in that creek bottom in October and November has either moved on or settled back into whatever it was doing before I started noticing it, and the two possibilities feel about equal to me. I put a sixth camera in this spring. Down in the low ground near the creek, on a big hackberry at the edge of the wet area, where the flooding keeps the brush thick and the ground soft enough to hold a track. I set it at 6 feet, 3-image burst, 10-second video. I checked it last Tuesday. Deer, a heron, the raccoon on his schedule. I've talked to 2 other farmers in this valley since the fall. Not in a way that came out and said what I'd seen, not directly, not at first. I found ways to bring up the subject at the edges, the way you do when you want to know if someone else has a story they haven't been telling. One of them, a woman who farms 80 acres on the Tippecanoe side of the valley and who has been working that ground for 30 years, looked at me in a way that told me she had something to say before she said a word. She told me her dogs had stopped sleeping outside 3 years ago and she had never been able to explain it. She told me there was a section of her creek bottom where her husband, who died in 2019, had stopped hunting in his last few years and had never given her a reason she believed. She didn't ask me why I was asking, and I didn't volunteer the footage. And at the end of the conversation, we both went back to talking about soybeans and the county road maintenance budget, and neither of us brought it back up. The second farmer, a man named Dale Eichorn, who runs a beef operation north of Delphi near where the Rock Creek drainage meets the county road, told me flat out that he'd heard sounds from his south timber in the winters of 2016 and 2020 that he'd never been able to account for, and that he'd long since stopped trying. He said they weren't coyotes and they weren't owls and they weren't anything a person could produce without equipment, and that was all he had to say on it. And we moved on. Dale Eichorn is a deliberate, straightforward man who doesn't waste words or time, and the fact that he'd been sitting on those 2 incidents for years without telling anyone was its own kind of testimony. I think what all 3 of us, me, the woman on the Tippecanoe side, Dale have in common is that we work the same creek country, and we have each arrived, in our own time and in our own way, at the same rough understanding. There is something else in this valley. It has been here longer than the farms. It moves through the creek timber and the low ground by the slate bluffs, and it keeps itself mostly out of sight. And on the rare occasion when it allows itself to be seen or needs to be seen, which may be different, the person who sees it carries that seeing for the rest of their life and doesn't know quite where to put it. I have a farm to run. I have a planting window to hit every April and a harvest window to hit every October. And the combine doesn't care what's in my south timber, and the market price for soybeans doesn't move based on what's on my trail camera card. The work is the same work it was before all of this, and there is a comfort in that. Actually, the corn goes in and comes out. The cattle calve in March and go to grass in May. The red oak on the flat above the creek bluff will be dropping acorns again in September, and the deer will be back on the scrape line, and the cameras in the timber will show me the same November world I've been looking at for 7 years. Except that I'll be looking at it differently. I'll be checking that 6th camera down in the hackberry and hoping, in a way I can't entirely explain, that the card has something on it I don't recognize. And at the same time, I'll be relieved if it doesn't, because I know now that recognizing something and knowing what to do with it are 2 separate things entirely. Ellen asked me last week whether I thought it would come back. I told her I didn't know. She stood at the kitchen window looking out toward the barn for a moment, and then she said, quiet, that she hoped the young one had healed up all right. I told her I hoped so too. We left it at that. There are some things that don't need more words than that. And in 31 years of marriage, Ellen and I have both learned to recognize them. I'll check it again in 3 days.